All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our Friday Digest series. This is our legislative webinar, or legislative priority webinar series right now. And we really appreciate you joining us for this. I am Marissa Olszewski, Environmental Policy Manager for Maryland LCV. And as always, your presence here on these webinars speaks volumes for the power of community and your commitment to environmental causes that affect us all here in Maryland. Our goal for these Friday Digests is to provide you with information, with tools, with resources so that you can be an informed and active advocate. We also want the agenda for all of these virtual meetings to be driven by your interests and your needs, so please let us know what you want to hear. At the end of the program, you will receive a link to a survey. That is the easiest way. If you fill that out, you can let us know what else you want to hear on these webinars. And as many are doing already, as you join us, please feel free to type your name and tell us where you're joining in the chat from where you're joining. And as we move through this today, you can also type questions or comments into the Q&A or into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can so that this webinar can also be a conversation with you. So I'm excited to dive deep into one of our key legislative priorities for 2025. It is the Nearshore Farm and Finance Act. This bill represents a truly important opportunity to protect the Chesapeake Bay while supporting our Maryland farming communities. Recent scientific analysis in the Chesapeake Bay program's comprehensive CSER report, that was a scientific report we've talked about before, not salad. It emphasizes the importance of targeted conservation practices, which include installing buffers along our coastal shoreline. And in those places, they are significantly more effective at protecting water quality than they are further upland. In fact, the University of Maryland Extension found that planting trees in the 100-foot buffer along our coastal waters is 6 times more effective at preventing nutrient pollution than the same practices further inland. Yet currently, Maryland allows farming as close as 35 feet from our tidal waters for crops and 10 feet for pasture land. So this bill is particularly compelling in that we can achieve significant reductions in pollutants to the bay while affecting only 0.19% of Maryland's farmland. That's less than 1/5 of 1%. By focusing on these most critical areas, we can maximize our impact while minimizing disruption to our agricultural communities. To help us understand both the environmental and agricultural aspects of this legislation, I'm pleased to welcome Annie Richards. Annie is a Chester Riverkeeper at ShoreRivers, a clean water voice for the Eastern Shore. Annie brings valuable perspective from working directly with both the farming communities and on water quality protection efforts. And before I hand it over to Annie for an overview of the bill, I want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions through the Zoom chat throughout the presentation, and then we'll also use the Q&A and have time for that after Annie's overview today. So Annie, thank you for joining us, and could you go ahead and start by walking us through what this bill would do and why it matters for the Bay and our farmers?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here this Friday, and thank you all for joining to learn more about Nearshore Farm and Finance. We're really excited about this bill. In addition to being lucky to work with Maryland LCV regarding this bill, we're also working with Chesapeake Bay Foundation and Chesapeake Legal Alliance to move this important initiative forward. I am dropping in the chat a link to the MGA website so that you can check out our bill and the bill language, and note that there are hearing dates already scheduled for SB 898 and HB 1175. We're super grateful to our sponsors, Senator Love and Delegate Stein, for caring for this fabulous legislation, and we can dive right in. I'm hoping that, okay, great. I was like, I know there's going to be a presentation that magically appears. Fabulous. So Nearshore Farm and Finance, you can go ahead and toggle to the next slide. thank you, Marissa, for bringing up the Caesar report. I'd like to give a little brief history of kind of the inspiration behind this bill. So at Shore Rivers, we've been talking since the Caesar report was released on its kind of significant implications for the Eastern Shore, non-point source pollution, how we target our conservation efforts moving forward, and also what do incentive programs look like? Because, you know, historically, Maryland has used incentive programs as a way to achieve progress for non-point source pollution, knowing that to really move that needle, you're talking about the actions of millions of different people, private industries, families. And so how do we look at our incentive programs moving forward? And you know, one of the ways you can see we've got a icon here that shows how the Caesar report recommends that we shifting from point source to non-point source, shift from incentive-based voluntary programs to more policy-driven behavior change, and then as well as priorities of looking at how do we measure our success, not by deep channel water quality at the bottom of the bay, but shallow water habitat health, where we can see immediate reactions from the change in land use and also a rebound of ecosystems, fisheries, habitat, and community access opportunities. You can see that there are 3 bulleted points here on this slide. These are direct quotes from Caesar that really kind of started us on this path of crafting this legislation, which is reducing our nutrient loads to the Chesapeake Bay depends largely on reducing non-point source pollution, right? That's our last and largest hurdle to meeting a lot of our TMDL associated goals with the Chesapeake Bay restoration. This one has really stuck with me from the Caesar report. A recent modeling effort estimated that the amount of dissolved inorganic nitrogen contributed during a seasonally high tide in one bay segment exceeded its entire annual load allocation by 30%. Now, if that was a really wordy sentence for you, what we can break that down is we have allowable nitrogen pollution loads that can go into our bay per bay segments as per the TMDL, or total maximum daily load, which is our pollution diet. And what this modeling effort is suggesting is that in one shoreline flooding event, 130% of allowable nitrogen for the entire year is going into the waterway. When we talk about a response gap and meeting hurdles to achieving our success for nutrient pollution cleanup, I think shoreline inundation is a clear contributing factor that we need to address rapidly. And then finally, the structure of existing incentive-based programs is not designed to identify or target best management practice implementation on lands with the highest reduction potential or the lowest abatement costs. In essence, currently, we don't target our conservation work. It's a first come, first serve. We could target a restoration practice upland in the watershed, and there's no driving force to get those folks who have the ability to target those conservation projects closer to the water to do so. So how do we get at all of these findings in a way that, lifts up both the industries they impact and achieves our environmental goals? That's what we're attempting to do here. If you want to go next slide. When Caesar says target, well, we want to target those areas where we know there's a higher pollution load. And for decades, we've really established the critical area as this known area within Maryland that we have a higher delivery rate. In fact, agencies from DNR to MDE cite regularly that the critical area, which is 1,000 feet landward of tidal waterways, has an 80% delivery rate for nutrient pollution compared to 50% within 1,000 feet of perennial surface water, compared to 30% when you're getting outside that 1,000 foot boundary, right? So we know that there is a clearly defined and identifiable area where we know nutrient pollution hotspots are occurring, and that's the critical area. Next slide. So knowing that background, our bill is seeking to do 3 things. 1, it's going to increase nutrient application setbacks on farmland bordering tidal waters to 100 feet. That's mandatory. And so we are not seeking a setback on farming activities. So farming activities are still allowable in all the zones they always have been. This will limit where you can apply fertilizer. So if a farmer wants to continue farming in that 100-foot space, but by amending soil through regenerative practices like diverse cover crop products, then that would be fine. But you can't use synthetic or organic fertilizers to amend your soil within this 100-foot buffer. And so the second thing this bill would do would be increase incentives for landowners that adopt or extend to 100-foot fixed natural filters based on land features along tidal waters. So essentially, right now, our nutrient application setbacks in Maryland are about 35 feet because there's a 25-foot setback on farming activities and a 10-foot nutrient application setback. So essentially, there's 35 feet of land that farmers typically do not work. And it's no coincidence that most conservation practices that are paid for by the state and federal government are 35 feet because that's the most commonly unused space on the farm. And so for landowners who are going to extend from 35 to 100 or adopt new buffers that are 100 feet, we want to make sure that there are increased incentives. And we want to make sure those incentives are influencing what conservation practice goes on that land. So your soil hydrology, your slope, elevation for sea level rise. There are many factors that Maryland Department of Agriculture can take into consideration when making a recommendation on what the best possible practice would be. Of course, many times, especially when we're up above 2 feet elevation, trees and riparian tree buffers are going to be that best practice. And we want to make sure folks are getting paid the best value for making that choice. The third thing that this bill does that we're really excited about is it establishes for the first time ever an incentive payment for tenant farmers. So 45% of agricultural land on the eastern shore of Maryland is leased farmland. We know that leased land operators and tenant farmers are the growing future of farm conservation, and they are the largest and fastest growing population of farmers. And currently, there aren't really incentive programs that include them in this conservation work. And that's going to be a growing problem across the decades as we continue forward in this work. So we want to make sure that they are brought into this conversation and there are incentives, because we know that the farmers who work this land are often the ones that are able to keep the closest eye on conservation work once it goes in the ground. So this would establish a 150 per acre per year incentive payment for a leased land operator in the critical area that has adopted these conservation buffers that we just spoke about. We can go ahead, next slide. So just to review, that first piece is a mandatory setback, and the second piece is, just elevated payments for a voluntary practice. No one has to implement those buffers. And then we're making sure that our incentive programs include compensation for tenant farmers who lose land when landowners enroll in conservation practices. Next slide, please. We feel really confident that this bill reflects accepted science, even beyond the CSER report. The CAS model from the Chesapeake Bay program recognizes these to be the estimated pollution reductions we would get from this bill if the shoreline impacted was to fully implement conservation practices. So our GIS analysis tells us that this bill will impact about 2,600 acres. Across the state, which, as Marissa mentioned, is an incredibly low fraction, less than 0.5% of all agricultural land. We are sensitive to the fact that it won't feel that way to the farmers who work that land. And that's why we want to make sure that we have the best possible incentives and the best possible payments for tenant farmers as well. You can see to the left, the larger gray graphic, that this is from a recent riparian buffer fact sheet that was released from University of Maryland Extension. You can see the most common buffer size, as we said, is 35 feet. And you can see the listed benefits that a buffer size can accomplish. And right now, we're just scratching the surface in terms of what nutrient reductions we can achieve with the typical buffer size. By expanding even just to 100 feet, you're starting to capture significant sediment control, flood control, wildlife and habitat benefits, and of course, increasing that nutrient removal. So increasing to 100 feet is really great. And of course, in terms of, we'd love to see voluntary programs go beyond that. Next slide, please. This bill also complements state goals. So many on this call may be familiar with the Tree Solutions Now Act, which passed in 2021. And that is where our General Assembly set a wonderful goal of planting 5 million trees by 2030 and allocated really once in a generation funds to accomplish that goal. Those funds will sunset with this act in 2030. MDA, Maryland Department of Agriculture, currently is appropriated 2.5 million from this fund every year. And at current rates, it is undersubscribed by about $2 million annually. So we know we need more policy drivers to help folks enroll in this program. And we feel that Nearshore Farm and Finance is an innovative way to both increase the incentive payments possible through this funding and also to drive more participation through policy guidance. It will also help DNR to meet their department goal of restoring 2,000 miles of riparian forest buffers by 2025. You know, we're coming up on that 2025 mark. Here we are. DNR hasn't met that goal yet. We want to increase that for them. Maryland Department of Agriculture is looking to increase by 50% the number of best management practices to meet nutrient reduction goals. And what we like about this bill is it's targeting the most effective practices so that we're impacting the smallest amount of farmland. That's the goal. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of close by saying this isn't just about minimizing impact to existing farmland. This is about protecting Maryland's farmland long term. This is an image of a farm I go by every summer as I engage in my routine water quality monitoring practices on the Chester River. And this farm, you can see in 1992 was where that arrow starts on the photo. And you can see since 1992, this farm has lost more than 50 meters of soil. The photo on the bottom right depicts the current farming practices that are employed on this farm field. And without buffers, we're going to continue to see that unstable cliff erode again and again. So by adopting these buffers, while there is some farmland that, of course, is taken out of rotation in service of those buffers, we think that the benefits long-term that this land will see are immeasurable beyond environmental benefits, you know, just protecting Maryland's land as well from erosion and climate impacts. I think that's all my slides. If anyone has any questions, of course, I'm here to answer. And just again, SB 898 does have a hearing on February 18th. So if anyone has questions on how they can reach out to support this bill, submit testimony, anything like that, I'm happy to answer any of that.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was that was a great, not just an overview, but you really went deep into some of the science, the why behind this bill, and I think really shared with everyone here why Maryland LCB has decided to support this as a priority piece of legislation. Can we just back up a little bit? And before we go into some of the other things, and we've got some great questions which align with some of the things I wanted to highlight. Can you explain for us, or for people, if there's anyone on this call who's like very new to what we're doing with Chesapeake Bay restoration, what happens when fertilizer and soil from farmland enter the bay? And so why is it that the current setbacks are inefficient or insufficient for achieving the goals of reducing that?
Yeah, great question. So currently, our rivers and our bay are impaired predominantly by excess amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment eroding into our waters. That happens from a couple of different ways. So sediment enters our waterway through surface runoff when it rains. It also happens when we have shoreline erosion that goes into our waterway. Nitrogen and phosphorus can also travel into our waterways when those two things occur. It's important to note that phosphorus can only move into a waterway when it's bonded with sediment. So those two levels are kind of linked in a lot of our data. This can also enter our waterway through legacy nitrogen and legacy phosphorus that enters through groundwater. So you have an immediate storm-related effect, you have immediate erosion effects from wind and climate impacts, and then there's also a delayed impact that sometimes takes decades to see the impact of one land practice and then it actually enter the water system through groundwater. And so one of the things that CSER really recommends that we implement is a strategy to reduce the amount of nutrients that we are introducing to the watershed in the first place. So while restoration is incredibly important and that's driving a big portion of this bill, one of the things that's really important as a standalone is this nutrient application setback will limit the amount of nutrients that's being introduced to the watershed because there's simply a larger strip of land where nutrients cannot be applied. And when we are not actively rotating that earth by tilling or applying fertilizer, if it's enrolled in a conservation practice of natural land, then also that reduces the amount of sediment that contains legacy nutrients that will enter the bay and our rivers through erosion. So that's really important. It may be also important to give you a little bit of historical context where, we mentioned that a lot of these activities are governed in the critical area. The critical area is a boundary and a program that's been in play for about 40 years. And when the critical area was established, there were an immense amount of listening sessions and public engagement and agency engagement and research engagement to define what the allowable land uses would be within this 1,000-foot boundary once it was established. And when looking back at the records, you can see that all the scientific research that was brought back then points to agricultural activities and really any development activities should give a 300-foot setback to tidal waters to really maximize nutrient reduction and assure that no activities will impact the waterway. Of course, we have lots of state goals we need to achieve across industries, our housing goals, so many things. And so really there are no activities within the critical area that follow a 300-foot setback. And farming happens to be a 35-foot setback when you account for both the farming activity setback and the 10-foot nutrient application. So what we're simply striving to do here is kind of increase to 100, which there is parity for. Maryland Department of the Environment expects that animal feeding operations, concentrated animal feeding operations, dairy farms, chicken farms, they're not allowed to store their manure within 100 feet of tidal surface waters. And so we're looking at what's been expected of this industry across other areas of the critical area, what has documented success at nutrient removal and nutrient reductions, and we're just kind of seeking parity with those existing regulations.
That's great. So one of the reasons that I really appreciate your work, Annie, is that you work very closely with the farmers in your area. They are part of your community and you engage with them. And we have some questions both in the chat and some things that I wanted to follow up on to let you speak to how you've worked with the farming community on this and what sort of feedback you're getting.
Sure. We've been doing a lot of community engagement over really the past 2.5 years leading up to this bill being submitted this session. And, I do want to be really clear. I don't speak for all farmers. We are so lucky to work across, the midshore, and we have developed a really robust relationship with a lot of farmers because we do think that farmland is one of our best opportunities, and farmers are some of our best partners to get restoration work in the ground and improve our waterways. And so we have engaged with farmers that run some of the largest dairy operations in the state. We have engaged with tenant farmers. We have engaged with farmers who are early adopters of riparian buffers that already have this work in the ground on their farms in the critical area and have seen some of the pitfalls, some of the challenges, and have informed recommendations for how we can do this work better in the future. And so we are excited to say that we do have farmers coming out in active support of this bill. And one of the key pieces of feedback that we've gotten from farmers is kind of this repeated point that I made earlier in the presentation, that more and more we have lease land operators. It is becoming more and more likely that for farmers to make a decent living, they cannot simply farm the amount of land that they own, and that every generation typically owns less. And so knowing that our current incentive programs aren't built to accommodate that, that's going to be a growing problem. And so the farmers that we have engaged with are really appreciative that this piece is included in the legislation, and that we as conservation organizations are also noticing this problem. And something that we've also learned from the environment or from the farming community is we want to make sure that our early adopters aren't left behind as these regulations progress. So if you have a 35-foot buffer right now, we want to be sure that as this bill is implemented, that if you want to expand from 35 to 100, you're going to be able to do that. It's not going to impact the contracts you already have on your current conservation buffer. And so that's been really valuable feedback that we're working to incorporate in the bill, and work with MDA as if this bill passes, as regulations kind of result from that. And something that we've also learned over the past 2 years is, initially when we first started this effort, we wanted to look at this effort through critical area law. And we are not doing that. That's not what this bill is, because we got really important feedback from the farming community that said, not only is this going to impact the amount of farmland we work, it's also going to impact our access to incentive programs, because it creates this kind of mitigation paradigm. And so that we're so grateful that farmers were willing to come to the table, share what was scary to them about the bill. And that wasn't our intention. And so we've evolved it to be a much more nuanced bill that we hope will, again, be that policy driver to increase participation. But we'll also, make sure that farmers are able to access all the programs that they've always been able to access. We have also engaged with grain producers, the Soil Conservation District Association, Farm Bureau. And while we have gotten preliminary feedback from them and sought it several times, and we've had good conversations where they really mirror a lot of the comments where, the loss of farmland is a challenge for a lot of farmers. Mandates are always scary for any industry. And, we can't, I'm sure that we will find out in the hearing, there are a lot of folks that are scared about this, approaching mandate. But the idea that we're taking this nuanced approach and that we're including incentive programs that more broadly complement and reflect what our farming community actually looks like, that's been well received. So we have just recently gotten bill language. Of course, this is the deadline today for House bills. And, it's always a flurry to get your draft language out from Department of Legislative Services. So now that actual bill language is out, we're looking forward to having more detailed discussions with those same groups now that we have that bill language in hand.
Great. And we've only got a few minutes left, but I did want to, we've got some very politically savvy people on the call today, and they're putting things in the chat that they're paying attention to Maryland's budget, and they're curious about the funding source and the cost of this bill, and sort of how we're reconciling that in this budget year.
Yep, absolutely.
Thoughts on that?
Yes. So when this bill language was initially drafted and put in, as I mentioned, historically, MDA has been appropriated $2.5 million for tree plantings through Tree Solutions Now Act 2021. And they have been appropriated that from a few years back all the way through fiscal year 2031. And that has been incredibly undersubscribed. And so that money in a tight fiscal year is a sitting duck. There's already talks about the governor reappropriating a significant portion of that money. And so one thing I can say is that concurrently with our work on this bill, we are striving hard with the General Assembly to make sure that Tree Solutions Now Act money is not touched and is left in place. We recognize the fiscal challenges. We also are grateful that the governor's team has largely tried to mitigate environmental impacts to funding, or impacts to environmental funding. This is one of those places where we think it's more important than ever that the governor fully appropriate this line item, because we only have until 2030 to meet this goal. It's a big goal, and we need to make sure that funding is in place to help us get there.
And I think many people on this call may have been involved in the first fight to get that funding in the first place. So
yeah, so that's point number one. We want to make sure that that line item comes back, knowing that this bill is all about driving participation to the MDA programs that are funded by that money. So if it comes back, we will, of course, be able to utilize that funding for this bill. And we also think that there are other cost share program funding pots at MDA that can help fund this work that are outside of the tree planting initiatives. And, finally, I would say that it would be probably impossible for all of this conservation work to take place in 1 year. So knowing that all of this work is going to be spread out over many years, is also something, to consider, that this won't have just a single 1 year fiscal impact. The fiscal impact will be spread out over many years. So
That's great. Thank you so much. And there we are. It's 12:30. We filled the half hour and it flew by. Annie, thank you so much. That was wonderful. To our audience, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your great questions in the chat and your engagement. If anything wasn't answered today as we were going through, please feel free to email those questions to us. We would love to get back to you with answers and continue to engage you on this work that we're doing. Finally, I just want to say before you leave that next Friday, we're hosting our next Friday Digest, and that one will be focused on the Coal Cleanup and Asthma Mitigation Act. So we hope you can join us for that as well. And as promised, that survey is in the chat. So please do go ahead and fill out that survey and let us know what you think about today's webinar and what else you would like to see. So thanks again, Annie. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a great Friday.